Hi, everyone. I hope that you're having a good weekend. The purpose of this video is to discuss chapter three from the textbook, which, again, obviously the book, Justice by Michael Sandel. We did the first two chapters before the midterm, and now we're moving into chapter three. As a reminder, chapter three begins on page 58 and goes to 74. The title of the chapter is Do We Own Ourselves? Libertarianism. I'll say more about that in 1 second. But just a few reminders about the class in terms of where we're at. You obviously had your midterm last week. I haven't yet graded those. I will get to those sometime this week. I hope to have grades to you by the end of the week. Um, I think that's it. I don't think I have any other announcements. Um, you will have a homework assignment and a discussion post this week. And as always, if you have any feedback for the class, never hesitate to reach out to me through email. I'm also available during my office hours if you ever need to discuss anything in person, or if any of you want to discuss any of the material in any more detail than you have the chance to do in an online class. Okay. But beyond that, what I want to do is then move into a discussion of the reading. And this week's reading deals with one of the central approaches to justice that Sandel introduced in that first introductory chapter. If you remember, Sandel introduces three approaches to the question of justice in that introductory chapter: an approach dealing with welfare or utilitarianism, which was discussed in chapter two, a virtue based approach to justice, which deals with, well, that one's a bit more complicated, but in general, it might ask a question like, which virtues or vices should society be promoting in terms of basic character traits? And then this approach that's in this chapter deals with freedom, liberty, and its fundamental question is, um, given some law, some policy, some action by the government, the central question is, does it respect individual liberty or freedom? And of course, this is the notion of liberty and the notion of freedom are huge concepts. Another word for it is autonomy. So I may use those words, and they may not always, when people say them, they may not always mean the same thing, but I may use them interchangeably in discussing this chapter. But the central question is, does the given law or policy or action of the government promote or respect individual liberty or autonomy, or does it in some way infringe on liberty and autonomy? And depending on your, you know, political philosophy, you may be willing to say that's the only question that matters. The other questions don't matter at all. That may be the only question that matters. And for a libertarian, somebody who's fundamentally committed to the philosophy of libertarianism, that is the only question that matters, is individual liberty. Now, some may criticize that and think that you can go too far in the, you know, in defending individual liberty and say there are more things that matter than that. And of course, utilitarianism would say that, but this is a different approach. And so that's what we're looking at here. And what I want to do, I have some notes that I'm going to talk through as I normally do. Um, but what I want to do first It's just, I want to just jump down here to the bottom because for those of you familiar with American politics, there is, what's called sort of an ideological spectrum of political beliefs. And this doesn't just apply to American politics, it applies to political beliefs in general, except in different countries in the world, the parties are given different names. So, for example, in the United States, it's called the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party, but in the UK, for example, in the United Kingdom, it's called the Labour Party. So it's always left and right and center in terms of how the spectrum is described, but then the names of the specific parties in the countries may be given different names. But the left right divide is universal. And so we have liberal left, and then you've got conservative right. And there's a lot more um, to this is a very simplified explanation. Some of you may be hearing the language of fascism, authoritarianism, socialist, communist, and those labels they all have specific meanings, and they also fall somewhere on this spectrum as well. I'm not talking specifically about those today. I'm just showing you this for the purposes of situating libertarianism, because libertarianism has affinities with both the left and the right, because of course you're going to have differences. In particular, this chapter is focused on the differences between economic beliefs and the differences in terms of social beliefs and economic beliefs, right? Because when it comes to a conservative, of course, when it comes to economic beliefs of conservatives, they generally favor cutting taxes. When it comes to things like social beliefs, there may be more of a kind of traditional um, view favoring laws against you know certain lifestyles, things like that, or activities. Sorry, this became a mess once I didn't prepare this ahead of time. I'm just um, doing this on the fly. So socially and culturally, they may be in favor of traditional views in terms of favoring laws that are against certain lifestyles or activities. Um, and then you've got liberals who tend to be less about cutting. They're not so much about I mean, raising. I mean, you might say they favor a more progressive taxation approach, meaning that the more money you make, the more you should pay in taxes. So when it comes to economic policy, over on the left, you might say that it's not only about raising taxes, it's just about having your income match the level of taxation that should apply to you. So if you make more, you should pay more. And if you make less, you should pay less. And that's a kind of, that's a very, again, this is a very simple explanation. There is a wider range of beliefs and views about tax policy than that, but that is just a quick way to think about it. But then you've got libertarians um, tend to have things in common with both. They have things in common with both. Libertarians in terms of social views and cultural views, would say, well, maybe cultural is, maybe cultural and social are a bit different, but there's some overlap there in terms of the fact that they both deal with questions of values. But a libertarian would say, does the law or policy promote individual liberty? And that's it. That's the question. Does it promote or respect individual liberty? And so when it comes to questions of social values, well, if you think about questions like gay marriage, questions about pornography, um, even issues today related, I think one of the issues that has become very, very hot button, even though I'm not sure it's certainly made out to be a hot button issue, although I'm not sure as many people care about it as it's portrayed to be. But certainly people try to gin up controversy about it to get people riled up. But as it relates to transgender politics, this is another issue that I think would kind of gay marriage is not as it's become more culturally and socially accepted. Um, you know, and then pornography, has its people debate about pornography, but it tends to not get as much attention as these other issues. The point is that libertarians would say the government shouldn't be passing laws either promoting certain behaviors or discouraging certain behaviors. They should basically leave it up to the individual to what they want to do for their lifestyle, as long as that lifestyle is not harming anyone else. That's obviously going to be the key. But for a libertarian, the question is, does your behavior, does your lifestyle harm someone else's liberty? Does it infringe on someone else's liberty? And if it doesn't, the government should have no position about that activity or lifestyle. It's not the government's job to be promoting or discouraging any individual behavior or any individual lifestyle. Again, as long as that behavior or lifestyle does not infringe on the liberty of somebody else. That's always the test. And so when it comes to pornography, or not pornography, I think prostitution was the one that I was meaning to say, not pornography. Though pornography, if a man wants to watch pornography in the privacy of his own home, again, that's not something that a libertarian would have a problem with. Um, the same with gay marriage. If two individuals love each other and they want to get married, it's not the government's position to say they shouldn't. The government's job is not to enforce a certain view of morality or religion. The same with transgender politics. If a child now, I get when I get it when it comes to children, that's where the issue really becomes the hot button issue. But even at the level of children, I mean, I guess is if a child expresses the desire to change their gender, um, and the parents, now there's a lot of the dispute arises at the level of the child, but and so maybe you say we're going to require that their parents consent to the treatment. And that's controversial. I understand that. And I'm not trying to wade into the politics here necessarily. I'm just saying that at a libertarian point of view, even at that level, it's not obvious to me why the government should be concerned with somebody's choice about whether or not to change their gender. If they believe that their gender identity does not match their biological sex that they were assigned at birth, if they have what's called gender dysphoria and they experience that, then it's not the government's job to have an opinion about what they should or shouldn't do. Now, again, if they're a child, then maybe it's not unreasonable to say that they should have their parents' consent to receive any kind of treatment. That may be, that may be the position that's needed, but beyond the idea that it's a minor, the idea that the government should not be telling parents that they can or can't allow their children to have access to these kinds of medications. Again, assuming it's not harming anybody else, then I don't. There's no problem. Again, from a libertarian point of view. So again, that's just a long way of saying when it comes to social issues and cultural issues, libertarians tend to be more aligned with liberals. But when it comes to economic policies, they tend to be more aligned with conservatives. And so this is where they're kind of both, right? Because again, for them, it's just about does the law or policy promote or respect individual liberty? And when it comes to things like taxes, even the very, and we're going to talk more about this, but the very idea of taxation itself, taxation is a violation of individual liberty because it robs me of something that I own, which is, well, we're going to say more about this, but for a libertarian, when I work and I earn money, that belongs to me. And to tax me is to violate my liberty in a fundamental way. It's to try to claim ownership of something that belongs to me, and the government should have no business doing that. And so when it comes to social issues, they tend to basically just, it's more of a live and let live. When it comes to tax policy, they tend to be against the government really having any kind of say when it relates to, interfering in the free market. So that's just kind of some background about, because in the United States, there are a lot of people who identify as libertarians. Now, I don't know the numbers. It's a much smaller number than would identify as a Democrat or Republican, but in presidential elections, there are candidates who run as libertarians. When you go to vote for presidential elections, there are often libertarian candidates on the ballot that you can vote for. And so they are a party. They have a lot of adherents. The you may One of the most well-known ones that you may be familiar with is Ron Paul, who's from Kentucky. He's probably one of the most well-known United States representatives for a long time. His son, Rand Paul, a senator from Kentucky, currently, who was Ron Paul's son, he's one of the most well-known libertarian politicians, libertarian mainstream politicians that you may or may not have heard of. I don't know. But he's currently a senator from Kentucky, and he's often in the headlines because he often he votes often with Republicans on matters of economic policy, but when it comes to other policies like social policies, cultural policies, uh, stuff about foreign policy, he tends to vote. I mean, it's not consistent always, but he tends to vote more with the left when it comes to those kinds of things. For example, right now, with what's going on in Iran, Rand Paul is an outspoken opponent of what's currently happening in Iran with the fact that we went to war there because he doesn't think that the government, um, constitutionally, the government, or that the executive branch, the president, constitutionally, should be waging war without approval from Congress. And so again, this is I'm getting into a lot of digressions here. The point I was just trying to show you where libertarian finds itself on a kind of spectrum in terms of political belief, um, is that they kind of have similarities with both the left and the right, and also there are some well-known libertarian politicians, Rand Paul being one of them. But what I want to do then, I want to just take a step back to really what is the philosophical kind of underpinning of libertarianism? Well, it's obviously liberty because the name itself, libertarianism, at the heart of it is the notion of liberty. And again, the fundamental question is for a libertarian, does the law or policy in question promote or respect individual liberty? That's it. That's the question for them. And so liberty stems from the idea of what is known as self-ownership. And this is the question. It's the title of our chapter. Libertarianism. Do we own ourselves? Do we own ourselves? Now, the idea of self-ownership goes back to a guy named John Locke, who you've already read about at a different point in the semester. Locke, famous social contract theorist. He's also famous for his influence on the founding of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, um, things like that. But Locke wrote a book titled Second Treatise of Government, which again was extremely influential. The founding fathers, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, all they were reading this text. It has a direct influence on the founding of the country. They're reading him. And the second treatise of government, a big idea of the second treatise of government is to defend the idea, or it's to defend a more democratic form of government against monarchy, which, as you can imagine, would have been relevant to the founding of the country. So again, this is kind of the larger aim of this book, is to argue for what are very, very familiar themes to Americans in terms of their political identity. We're against monarchies, we're against kings, and individual rights. This is, if there's like one thing that is at the cornerstone of what it means to be an American and to have an American political identity, it's to believe in the notion of individual rights, regardless of whether you're Democrat, Republican, Libertarian. Individual rights matters to everyone, regardless of your political party. Um, and so these are some of the core ideas of Locke. But one of the things that Locke outlines in the second treatise of government, he provides an argument for the notion of private property. He provides an argument for the notion of private property. And he says, how, this is the question. So if you guys remember the state of nature that was discussed in the readings about social contract theory, state of nature was a imagined condition where there is no government. And when Locke is thinking about the state of nature, he asks himself this: how is it that land that is held in common can come to be owned by? In other words, Locke is imagining that in this state of nature, no one had was able to claim ownership because, again, there's no money, there's no government. This is the state of nature, without government, without property. And he wants to say, before the creation of government, how is it that somebody could own something? How could they claim that this? How could you claim that something is mine? And how could somebody else, the notions of mine and yours, how do those arise? How do the very ideas of those arise in the state of nature when everything is held in common? And Locke basically says this. Well, he says it happens when I mix my labor with the land. In other words, when well, I don't need to say more than that. When I mix my labor with the land. And what does he mean? Well, the idea is this: I own my labor, meaning, and what he means by labor is literally meaning the physical acts that I engage in with my body right? That's what he means by labor. So the most famous example is picking an apple. If there's an apple on a tree and I pick it, it's mine because my labor belongs to me. And as a consequence, anything that I produce or acquire as a result of my labor becomes mine. That's what it means. So I own my labor. So then the argument anything that I come to possess through my labor is also, I own my labor. Anything that I come to possess through my labor as a result becomes mine. This is his argument. It's called the labor theory of property, meaning that what allows for stuff to be mine is that I worked for it. And because I own my labor, in other words, my labor is literally what I do with, and it's, and I own my body. It would seem, it doesn't seem controversial to say that I own my body. Because I own my body, I own the labor that I engage in with my body. And as a result, whatever I come into possession with through my labor becomes mine. That is and that idea of owning my body, owning myself, right? Because that is what is at the foundation of libertarianism is self-ownership of my body and my labor, right? That is the foundation of libertarianism. It's the philosophical underpinning of libertarianism as a set of political beliefs. And that's the foundation of it all the way back in John Locke. So I just wanted to explain that to you because that's the title of this chapter is Do I Own Myself? And the question is how far are you willing to go with this logic of self-ownership? Because for a libertarian, there are some who are very, very fervently committed to it, so much so that there's no other relevant consideration when it comes to laws and policies as does it respect self ownership, liberty? If it does, great. If it doesn't, it should not be a concern of the government. And of course, this is going to lead to a view that says that the government's role in the lives of individuals is going to be extremely minimal. There's going to be very little that the government should actually be doing. In fact, one of the fundamental roles that the government should do is to intervene when individual liberty is at stake. And if individual liberty is at stake, the government has a role to play. And so, anyways, that's a lot, but I just wanted to give you that background up here in terms of liberal conservative libertarianism, and then this philosophical background in terms of John Locke. Now, jumping back up to what Sandel says about libertarianism. Libertarians, according to Sandel, basically they have three fundamental, they reject three fundamental kinds of laws or policies that the government should be engaged in because they think that, as we just saw, that the government has a very, very minimal role to play in the lives of individual citizens. Free markets control the economy, and liberty controls the individual. The government only has a role to play to resolve disputes over property and liberty. And that's about it. So the first one, which, is this one's pretty controversial because it's something I asked you about last week. This first one it puts utilitarianism, it puts welfare-based approaches directly at odds with liberty-based approaches. Because a welfare-based approach, on the one hand, is going to say, what is best for the community? What is the greatest good for the greatest number? What benefits the most people? And if it violates individual rights along the way, that might be okay if the larger community is made better off as a result. For a libertarian, that is a non-starter. They reject the premise of welfare-based approaches because a welfare-based approach has as one of its premises that the individual matters less than the community. For libertarianism, that cannot be possible because the fundamental unit of libertarianism is individual liberty, right? Individual liberty. And at the end of the day, one of the things about human beings is that we get to decide for ourselves what level of risk to assume with our lives. So, this is what liberty is. Liberty for a libertarian is that human beings are we decide for ourselves what level of risk we want to assume. Assume it now. Again, the background assumption, assuming we're not harming others with our liberty. So as long as we're not harming others with our liberty, then it's up to us what level of risk we want to assume. And so this is where libertarians really draw a hard line and they say the government should never be stepping in to try and protect us from ourselves. Because if I want to risk my life to do something without harm, that now again, if I want to risk my life to do something that doesn't harm anybody else, it's my business, it's my responsibility. The government should have no say because it's my decision. I get to assume risk. That's what it means to be human. It means that I assume risk. So, for example, if I want to drive my car without wearing my seatbelt, so be it. That's a decision that I make. The government should not have a role to play in deciding what level of risk I want to assume about my life. And that's what a libertarian wants to say. Individual liberty is so important that even if I make dumb decisions, it's not the government's job to prevent me from making stupid decisions. It's my job to decide if I want to make stupid decisions. And if I do, I'll learn the consequences and I'll become a better person as a result. But the problem is when the government steps in to try to do that for me, I will never be able to learn. And so, you can see the appeal of this kind of thinking in some instances, not in all instances, but maybe in some instances. So when it comes to seatbelt laws or safety laws, seatbelt laws or helmet laws. So seatbelts are one that I see a lot, and I remember one of you in your discussion post used seatbelts as an example, but also helmets. Um, Motorcycle helmets are usually a big one, and the laws around motorcycle helmets vary by state. Different states have different laws. But I think the argument that would be a classic one, a motorcycle helmet, is that if you want to assume the risk of dying from a motorcycle accident when there is evidence to suggest that most people that don't wear helmets and get in crashes end up with severe head injuries, again, it's not the government's job to protect you from yourself. If you want to assume that risk, go ahead and do it. It's not the government's job to do that for you. And that's the logic of a libertarian. So, in other words, the argument is no paternalism. Paternalism is when you treat an adult like a child. It's paternalistic, meaning you try to protect them from themselves. And it's not the government's job to do that. No morals legislation. And again, this is where libertarians tend to be closer to the more liberal side of the spectrum, meaning that There shouldn't be laws against prostitution or same sex marriages because it's a violation of one's right to choose their own lifestyle. So, again, this is where they're closer to liberals, meaning they are very liberal about lifestyle choice. As long as my lifestyle choice doesn't harm somebody else, then what's the problem? And I, and again, this one feels like um, has some intuitive appeal. Individual liberty about lifestyle choice seems like it should um it should be something that is kind of live and let live, you know. And then the last one, and this one is more. This is probably the one where they tend to be more controversial. I think is laws regarding taxation. There should be no redistributive taxation, meaning we should not be taxing wealthier people in order to provide that money to poorer people. Right? We shouldn't be doing that. And this is where they tend to be closer to conservatives, where they would be all about the less taxes, the better. And especially, there should not be progressive taxation. We should not be taxing wealthier people more money. Now, there's a lot of, um, there tends to be a lot of populist sentiment right now, especially on the left. There's this kind of demonization and vilification of billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, um, because they're billionaires. The idea is that they should be, taxed more to help. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong, but there is a kind of a lot of rhetoric and sentiment about that kind of thing. But for a libertarian, that's a no go. That's a non-starter. We shouldn't be taxing billionaires to provide more money to poor people because at the end of the day, that is a violation of individual liberty. Um, it's their money; they worked for it, and it belongs to them. Now, I get it. Some of you are going to say, "Well, how much of that money did they actually work for?" They're treating their workers like crap. They're polluting the environment, all this stuff. And I get it, right? I'm not here to defend the billionaires. I'm simply saying that for a libertarian, at least, that kind of thinking is a dangerous road. Um, when you start saying that we need to tax billionaires more, and ultimately, what a libertarian is going to say is that we should allow these individuals to donate the money on their own. They should be able to decide for themselves. That's the liberty part. Is if Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg want to philanthropically, through charitable giving, help poor people, then let them do it. But the government should not force them to do it. That is where the that's usually where the debate is. From a liberty perspective, it's clear for the libertarian that we should not be forcing them to uh, be we should not be forcing them through taxation to give more money. But again, on the welfare side, you could see how somebody who's a proponent of the welfare argument would say, well, if this government policy can actually help more people and harm a few billionaires, well, then why not do it? And so that's where the argument would really, butt heads. So again, um, these are the big arguments that a libertarian would be against. No paternalism, no morals legislation, meaning the government should not be having a say in personal lifestyle choices about individuals as long as those lifestyle choices don't harm other people. And then we should not be redistributing tax money. So there's an example that's given in the book in terms of there's a 20th century libertarian philosopher by the name of Robert Nozick. So Robert Nozick is a very, very, very prominent uh, 20th century libertarian philosopher. And he provides a thought experiment dealing with, well, his original example at the time he wrote was the basketball player Wilt Chamberlain. Um, but the book updates the example through the example of Michael Jordan. And I just want to read from the book what is said. So I'm just going to read this real quick. So on page 64, and there's some terminology here that I didn't go through, but I'm just going to read from the book. So I'm reading from 64, Michael Jordan's Money. To set aside any question about initial holdings, let's imagine Nozick suggests that to set the initial distribution of income and wealth to whatever pattern you consider just. Now the basketball season begins. Those who want to see Michael Jordan play, those who want to see Michael Jordan play deposit $5 in a box each time they buy a tickets. The proceeds go in the box to Jordan. Since many people are eager to say Jordan play, attendance is high and the box becomes full. By the end of the season, Jordan has $31 million, far more than anyone else. As a result, Jordan has 31, sorry, I can't read. As a result, the initial distribution no longer obtains. Jordan has more and others less. But the new distribution arose through wholly voluntary choices. Who has grounds to complaint? Not those who paid to see Jordan play. They freely chose to buy the tickets. Not those who dislike basketball. They didn't spend any money on Jordan. And surely not Jordan. He chose to play basketball in exchange for a handsome sum of money. Nozick believes this illustration illustrates two problems. First, liberty upsets patterns. Anyone who believes that economic equality is unjust will have to intervene in the free market and continuously undo the effects of the choices people make. Second, intervening in this way, taxing Jordan to support programs to help the disadvantaged, it overturns the results of voluntary transactions. It violates Jordan's rights by taking his earnings. It forces him to make a charitable contribution against his will. So this is, again, there are two arguments here, right? The idea is that, first of all, it's not the government's job to try to rectify inequality because inequality is the result of individual voluntary choices. And also, it takes something against Jordan's will. By taxing Jordan to support other people, you're taking money from him. Right? So this is just an analogy to show that um, Jordan earned $31 million, and we may complain that he makes too much money, but what if it's the fans who went to that paid the money to go to see him? And now we're going to try to take that away from him, even though it was a completely voluntary transaction, right? And so this goes a bit further from here. You know what 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 Sandel is getting at, and um, Nozick ultimately, this is a he takes a really hard line here. He basically says that taxation amounts to a kind of almost taxation is akin to slavery. And it may sound kind of over the top, but the general idea is that this is the argument. Taxation is taking my earnings are equivalent to taking my labor, and taking my labor is equivalent to forced labor. That's the argument, right? In other words, when you tax my labor, you're taxing, you're taking my money. My money was produced from my labor. So now you're claiming ownership of me. When you tax me, you own me. The government is saying that it owns me. And the extension of that is that then you're forcing me to work for the government. Now, you can decide on your own whether you think that that is too over the top, too extreme, but there is a logic to it. Don't just dismiss it because it sounds hyperbolic. There is a logic to it. If my money belongs to me and my money was produced through my labor and the government is taxing my money, then they're claiming ownership of me in a way. It's not, there is a logic to it. You may not agree with the logic, but there is a logic to it. So don't just assume that that's over the top and hyperbolic. Um, Now, there are some objections that are discussed in here. I'm not going to go through each individual objection. You can look at those on your own. I do think, anticipating something that's coming up in a few weeks, the one objection that I want to um, talk about that Sandel introduces and he thinks is actually the most compelling objection, and I don't have it here in the notes, but it's objection 5. And it's the idea that Jordan is lucky. Individuals are lucky. And so this one, again, this may have some dangerous implications, but I want you to think about this idea of was Jordan lucky? And is anyone who is really talented or earns a lot of money, how much luck was involved? And this gets controversial very quickly because it can sound like you're saying that Michael Jordan doesn't deserve the money that he earns. And it's not entirely that, but there's something true about the fact that Jordan was born with he won the genetic lottery. He's an athletic freak. And so and also he happens to live in a society that values basketball. That's also luck, right? So there is luck involved with success. Some success involves luck. Some achievements involve luck. The question is how much is due to luck and how much is due to effort. Obviously, a lot of it is due to effort. People work very hard for the money that they make and for their achievements. No one's trying to take that away. But if you have to acknowledge the role that luck plays in your achievements, does it change the view that you have of the role that government should be playing? Because what about the people that are unlucky? Does the government have any role to play in rectifying those who are born into circumstances that are unlucky? And let me just give you some examples. Things like education, housing, healthcare. Lots of people, lots and lots and lots of people in the United States don't have access to good education, to good housing, and to good healthcare. And some might say, you hear the phrase, through no fault of their own, meaning it's not their fault that they don't have access to good education. It's not their fault they don't have access to good housing. And it's not their fault. That doesn't mean that they're not going to get a job and try to get an education, to get housing, and to get healthcare. But they may just be unlucky through their life circumstances. And the question then becomes what role does the government have in trying to help people get access to education, access to housing, and access to healthcare? And these are the kinds of questions where this is where the philosophical divide between libertarians, liberals, and conservatives really, this is where you see it. Because the role that the government has in providing access to education, providing access to healthcare, and providing access to housing, just to give you some examples, this is where the parties divide all over the place. These are all the debates that are had in politics about what role the government should have in helping out with these kinds of things, right? A libertarian who's committed to only self ownership is going to say that the government has no role to play in these things, is that it's all about individual responsibility. But the problem with that view is that it ends up blaming people for their circumstances, when in fact, they didn't do anything to deserve their circumstances. It's simply that they were unlucky through their birth. They were born into a world where they don't have access to education, housing, and healthcare. Again, that doesn't mean that the government should provide them with everything for free, but maybe they should help, maybe give them some help. Just as an example, the college that you guys are attending, Great Basin College, is a community college, which is a publicly funded institution that is providing people with access to education that are not able to get it potentially. It's the only way that they can get access to an education. So it's just that kind of thing that, you know, it's fine to be committed to self-ownership and individual liberty, but I think it's possible to go too far in that direction. And so that's just something to think about. Is Because I think sometimes the refrain that I've heard from students in the past is, well, life isn't fair, right? Life isn't fair. And so somebody might say, well, I'm poor and I don't have access to education. And your response could be, well, life isn't fair. But sometimes I wonder, what does that mean to say life isn't fair? Does that mean just because life isn't fair, does that mean we shouldn't try and rectify some level of unfairness? Because unfairness may just be, it's not that, we think of fairness as something, you deserve. We say that's unfair, meaning you didn't deserve that. And if it's true that people didn't deserve to be poor or deserve to be born into the situation they're in, then maybe that unfairness isn't their fault, and the government maybe should have some role to play in trying to rectify unfairness. Now, again, the libertarian is going to say the government should have no role to play in rectifying unfairness. That is not the government's job. But again, these are the questions that form political debates, right? And so I just wanted to kind of go into that a little bit more, give you some background. And that's really all I'm going to say for today. You guys can think about that more for this week and let me know if you have any questions.